Let us begin slowly, calmly, and with the soft unraveling of time. Imagine Cairo in the 19th century, not the bustling metropolis of bright lights, highways, and modern traffic, but rather a sprawling city of dust, colored buildings, narrow streets, and markets that never seemed to sleep. The call of the muezzin floated through the air 5 times a day, echoing across rooftops and courtyards, mixing with the shouts of street vendors selling bread, fruit, and cheap tobacco. The city smelled of sweat, donkey dung, baked bread, and sometimes, when the wind carried it, the thick, unmistakable aroma of hashish smoke. Hashish, that concentrated resin pressed from the cannabis plant, had a long, complicated story in Egypt. By the 1800s, it was neither entirely accepted nor entirely forbidden. It lived in the shadows, somewhere between indulgence and crime. In coffeehouses tucked into alleys, groups of poor men gathered to smoke, letting the smoke curl lazily around the wooden beams, their laughter sometimes turning into silence, their thoughts drifting to other worlds. For the poor, hashish was a cheap escape. A small amount could carry the mind away from hunger, cold, or despair. And yet, this very escape pulled many further into poverty. The cycle was subtle, and like all spirals, it began slowly. A worker, perhaps a porter who carried sacks along the docks of the Nile, or a craftsman who could no longer find steady work in a changing economy, might spend a coin or two on a little hashish. It helped dull the body's ache. It softened the sharp edge of hunger. It promised relaxation, laughter, even a kind of dreaming wakefulness. But what was first a small indulgence soon became a habit. Coins disappeared more quickly, meals became thinner, and debts quietly grew. 19th-century Cairo was no easy place for the poor. The Ottoman administration, and later the tightening control of European powers, had reshaped the economy. Land taxes were heavy, grain was exported abroad, and many peasants who once survived on the land drifted into the city, seeking work that rarely matched their needs. Cairo swelled with the dispossessed. In its crowded quarters, poverty bred restlessness, and restlessness sought relief. And so, in smoky rooms where clay pipes passed from hand to hand, men found a fleeting balm. One must imagine the coffeehouses of the time, not grand establishments for elites, but dim, crowded, and noisy spaces for the common man. Low wooden stools stood near round tables. The floor was dusty, sometimes damp. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows against the walls, their smoke adding to the haze. Alongside tea and bitter coffee, hashish was offered discreetly, often hidden until trusted customers arrived. The clientele was not refined. They were porters, beggars, failed farmers, day laborers, and sometimes soldiers on leave. Some came with friends, others in silence, but all shared a desire for release. To outside observers, European travelers, officials, or local elites, these dens of smoke were symbols of Egypt's weakness. They wrote reports describing lazy men, dazed workers, and a city dragged down by intoxication. In their eyes, hashish was both a cause and a symptom of decline. Yet, from within, the story was more complex. For the poor themselves, it was not decadence, but survival. Without money for meat, without security of work, without hope of land or property, hashish offered a few hours of forgetting. But forgetting had its cost. As more men spent their little wages on the substance, families sank deeper into need. Wives struggled to feed children, debts mounted with local shopkeepers, and landlords grew impatient with unpaid rent. Arguments flared in cramped homes. The spiral tightened the more poverty grew. The more hashish promised to ease it, and the more hashish was consumed, the deeper poverty dug its claws. The authorities, both local and colonial, were never blind to the habit. Throughout the century, bans on hashish appeared and disappeared. Pipes were smashed, sellers punished, shipments confiscated. But enforcement was uneven, and corruption ensured that trade continued. Smugglers carried hashish down the Nile, across borders, and into the city markets. Officials themselves sometimes looked the other way, for a bribe or simply for lack of energy, to fight what seemed unstoppable. What is striking in this cycle is not only the poverty of individuals, but the poverty of a city caught between worlds. Cairo in the 19th century was at once medieval and modernizing. Narrow alleyways still echoed with donkey hooves, but gas lamps and telegraphs had begun to appear. Foreign merchants established banks and factories, but the local poor rarely benefited. They bore the costs of higher prices and heavier taxes. Against this backdrop, hashish was less a temptation than a refuge, less a pleasure than an anesthetic. The spiral of hashish and poverty was not unique to Cairo, yet here it seemed especially visible. Travelers described ragged men sprawled in corners, their eyes glazed, muttering to themselves. Doctors worried about wasted bodies and dulled minds. Preachers condemned the vice as a sin, urging repentance. But for the man who had nothing, no steady food, no future, no dignity in the eyes of rulers, the preacher's sermon carried little weight compared to the warm comfort of smoke in his lungs. And so, night after night, the cycle deepened. Cairo's poor walked the narrow balance between work and waste, between effort and escape. Families stretched every coin, while husbands and fathers drifted into clouds of resinous smoke. The children grew thin, the wives grew weary, and the streets grew louder with the sounds of hunger. The city itself seemed to breathe in this rhythm of striving and forgetting, rising each morning with its workers, and falling each night into the haze of intoxication. What, then, is the lesson of this spiral? Perhaps that poverty itself is a trap that breeds further traps. Perhaps that in a city strained by foreign control and local injustice, the poor clung to whatever small relief they could find, even if it dragged them deeper into despair. The spiral was not simply about hashish, nor about laziness, nor about weakness. It was about a society where wealth was scarce for many and abundant for a few, where hardship pressed so tightly that the promise of forgetting, even briefly, was worth any price. And in the quiet hours, long after the markets closed and the lamps dimmed, one could still see the silhouettes of men huddled in smoky corners, breathing in the slow escape, exiling their hunger into the night air. Their lives, bound by the spiral, became part of Cairo's long history, a history not of great rulers or monuments, but of ordinary people caught in the endless cycle of poverty and fleeting relief. The story of 19th-century Cairo is full of monuments, revolts, and transformations. But beneath the surface of these grand events lies this quieter story, the story of how the city's poorest survived, how they coped, and how, in their coping, they often fell deeper into hardship. The spiral of hashish and poverty may not be celebrated in books of history, yet it is as real as any battle, as telling as any treaty, for it reveals the daily struggles that shaped the lives of thousands, and it whispers to us still, reminding us that the weight of poverty is not only measured in empty stomachs, but also in the desperate ways people seek to forget them. And so, we leave 19th-century Cairo in its haze, streets dark, air thick, voices murmuring in corners. The spiral continues slow, inevitable, and silent, wrapping lives in smoke and shadows. Let us drift back once more into the Cairo of the 19th century, a city both ancient and restless, a place where the lives of the poor stretched quietly in the shadows of minarets and the Nile's endless flow. We have already seen the haze of hashish smoke curling through dim coffeehouses, the gaunt faces of men who spent their last coin on forgetfulness, and the weary families left waiting at home. Now, let us sink deeper, exploring the slow rhythms of this spiral, the ways in which it crept into every corner of daily life, tightening like a coil around the city's poorest. To walk through Cairo at that time was to witness contrasts so sharp they could almost cut the air. Along wide boulevards that had begun to appear under new rulers, wealth displayed itself in fine carriages, European dress, and well-lit shops. Yet only a few streets away, poverty pressed down like the desert sun, heavy and relentless. Narrow alleys twisted into darkness, their walls leaning inward, as if the very city sagged under the weight of hunger. In these alleys lived the men and women most entangled in the spiral of hashish and want. The mornings in these quarters began not with leisure, but with scrambling. Men rose before dawn, their stomachs hollow, to search for work. Some headed to the Nile docks, hoping to be chosen as porters. Others wandered into markets, offering their backs, their hands, their sweat for whatever coin could be spared. The competition was fierce. Too many hands, too little work. Wages, when given, were meager. Sometimes only enough for bread and onions. And yet, despite this fragile existence, a portion of those wages drifted elsewhere, into the purchase of hashish, a balm against both hunger and despair. The cycle began quietly, almost invisibly. A worker, exhausted by failure, would spend a single coin to share a pipe in a coffee house. The smoke dulled the sharpness of his troubles. It was not drunkenness, not noise, but rather a quiet, dreamlike calm. For a few hours the worries of debt, hunger, and lost pride seemed to float away. But the hours passed, and the troubles returned, heavier than before. The worker, remembering the relief, sought it again. Thus the spiral gained its hold. For families, this meant an ever-growing tension. Wives, burdened with the task of stretching thin coins into meals, found themselves with less and less. Children who needed bread went without. Arguments filled cramped rooms at night, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in shouts. A husband, ashamed of his failures, sought relief in smoke. His wife, angry at his weakness, despaired at her own helplessness. The children listened, silent, wide-eyed, learning too early the language of hunger and sorrow. Outside the home, the spiral revealed itself in public spaces. The coffeehouses that dotted the city became both refuge and trap. These were not grand cafes but small, dim establishments tucked into alleys. Low tables, chipped cups, and the ever-present clay pipes. Oil lamps flickered against smoke-darkened walls. Men gathered, not with hope, but with resignation. Their laughter, when it came, was brittle. Their silence, when it fell, was heavy. The smoke bound them together in forgetfulness, each exhale a shared surrender. Authorities knew of these places, of course. Edicts were passed, bans declared, raids conducted. Pipes were broken, dens closed, smugglers punished. Yet the trade persisted. For every den destroyed, another opened in secret. For every confiscated shipment, another slipped down the Nile by night. The officials, some strict, others corrupt, played their endless game of suppression and tolerance. The poor, meanwhile, carried on as always, caught between hunger and haze. The spiral was not only economic but also social. Those who smoked too often found themselves excluded from certain jobs, their reputations marked. Employers hesitated to hire a man known for his weakness. Landlords grew impatient with unpaid rent. Neighbors whispered about households sinking into ruin. Shame mingled with need, creating a silence that weighed as heavily as debt. Many men hid their habit from their families, sneaking into coffeehouses under cover of night, returning home with eyes glazed and pockets empty. Cairo itself seemed to pulse with this rhythm of striving and forgetting. In the daytime, the markets bustled with noise, traders shouting, donkeys braying, children darting between stalls. But at night, the city exhaled. The call of the muezzin faded into darkness, and the alleys filled with smoke and murmurs. The spiral tightened most in these hours, when the poor sought refuge from the day's failures. European travelers, passing through, often wrote in their journals with judgmental eyes. They saw only laziness, weakness, and moral decay. To them, the hashish smoker was proof of Cairo's backwardness. Yet what they failed to grasp was the deeper wound: poverty, so entrenched that forgetting became the only affordable relief. These travelers, with their wealth and freedom, could not imagine the crushing weight of a life lived always on the edge of hunger, always one step away from collapse. Religious leaders, too, spoke against the habit. In sermons, they condemned hashish as sin, as poison, as a destroyer of families. Some listened, nodding, perhaps even promising to abstain. But hunger is a force stronger than many sermons. When the body aches and the mind despairs, the promise of a brief escape outweighs distant warnings of sin. And so, the faithful return to their pipes, their prayers mingling with smoke. What makes the spiral tragic is its inevitability. Poverty drove men to hashish, and hashish deepened poverty. Each turn of the cycle fed the next. A man too dazed to work lost opportunities. A man who spent his wages on smoke left his family hungry. A family weakened by hunger found it harder to survive. The city itself seemed powerless to break the chain. Officials raided, preachers warned, travelers judged, but the spiral wound on, slow and relentless. In time, whole neighborhoods became known for their haze. Outsiders avoided them, fearing theft, filth, or corruption. Yet within, life continued. Children played in dusty courtyards, women fetched water from wells, men sought work in vain. The spiral did not erase life, it simply dulled it. Like a veil of smoke over the city's poor. And through it all, the Nile flowed steadily, indifferent to the struggles on its banks. The great river carried wealth and trade, but it also carried the small boats of smugglers, their cargo of pressed resin hidden beneath sacks of grain. The authorities watched, sometimes chasing, sometimes ignoring, as the trade slipped through their fingers. The river, ancient and eternal, seemed to mock their efforts, carrying both life and ruin with equal calm. As the century wore on, Cairo grew, modernized and changed. Yet the spiral of hashish and poverty remained a constant undercurrent. For while rulers came and went, while streets widened and factories rose, the poor remained poor, their struggles unchanged. And so, in the quiet corners of the city, the pipes still glowed, the smoke still curled, and the spiral still tightened, unseen by the great men of history, but lived by the countless forgotten. What lingers most in this story is not the smoke itself, but the silence around it. The silence of wives too wary to protest, of children too hungry to speak, of men too ashamed to admit their weakness. It is a silence heavy with resignation, a silence that still echoes faintly when one walks the old streets of Cairo, where history remembers rulers and monuments, but forgets the smoky dens of the poor. And so, as we close this chapter, let us imagine once more the city at night, the flicker of oil lamps in narrow alleys, the low murmur of voices in crowded rooms, the slow curl of smoke rising toward the ceiling beams. Outside, the stars glimmer faintly above the desert. The Nile moves on in its eternal flow, and the spiral continues, unseen yet unbroken. Cairo, in the 19th century, was a city that lived in layers. The grand mosques and palaces stood like monuments to centuries of power and faith, but beneath their shadows stretched endless neighborhoods of poverty. To walk through these narrow alleys was to step into a world of hunger, dust, and slow despair. In these alleys, where families crowded into single rooms, and where the walls themselves seemed tired of standing, the spiral of hashish and poverty found its firmest grip. Let us wander slowly through such a quarter, on a day like any other. The morning sun rises harshly over the city, its light sharp and unforgiving. The poor wake early, though not with energy, but with necessity. Men stumble from their homes, hungry already, to seek whatever labor the day might offer. Some head toward the great market, where donkeys and carts crowd the streets and traders shout their prices. Others walk to the river, hoping for work unloading sacks from boats or carrying goods into the city. For most, the search ends in disappointment. Too many men, too little work. Too many coins already promised to others more fortunate. Hunger has a way of shaping the body, of hollowing the cheeks, of slowing the step. But hunger also shapes the mind. It makes every small relief feel larger, every fleeting comfort seem priceless. And so, when a man fails to find work, when his pockets are empty and his pride wounded, the temptation of the coffee house grows stronger. The coffee house in this neighborhood is not a grand place. It is a single room, dark and cramped, with stools and benches scattered unevenly. The floor is coated in dust, and the air is heavy with smoke. Lamps flicker weakly, their soot staining the low ceiling. Here, the men gather. They drink bitter coffee, their cups chipped and stained, and they pass the clay pipes hand to hand. Hashish burns slowly, filling the room with its thick, sweet smell. The men talk in low voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes sitting in silence. Outside, the world is harsh and demanding. Inside, for a few hours, it softens. This is the heart of the spiral. The man who has failed to earn wages today spends the last coin in his pocket not on bread, but on smoke. He tells himself it is only this once, only to forget the day's humiliation. Tomorrow, he promises he will be stronger. But when tomorrow comes, hunger gnaws again, work eludes him again, and the coffeehouse waits, patient and welcoming. The spiral tightens, not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow, almost invisible turn of events. Families feel this spiral more keenly than anyone. In small rooms, wives try to stretch what little food they have. Bread is rationed, onions divided carefully, lentils boiled thin to make them last. Children grow restless, crying from hunger, their bodies frail. A mother scolds her husband when he returns smelling of smoke, her anger sharpened by desperation. He shouts back, ashamed but defensive, claiming the smoke helps him bear the misery of their lives. Night after night, the same quarrels echo through narrow walls, and neighbors hear the sorrow as clearly as their own. The authorities know of these habits, of course. Edicts against hashish are issued with regularity. Officials raid coffeehouses, smash pipes, and seize blocks of resin from smugglers. Yet these efforts are like striking the water of the Nile with a stick. The river ripples, then flows on as before. Hashish arrives steadily, hidden in cargo, carried in secret. Officials are bribed, or simply look the other way. Some even indulge themselves, privately, despite their public condemnations. The cycle of prohibition and indulgence becomes another layer of the spiral, one more thread in the tangled knot of poverty and escape. Beyond Cairo's poor quarters, the wealthy look down with judgment. European travelers write long descriptions in their journals, painting the poor as lazy, weakened, and lost in smoke. Local elites shake their heads, speaking of moral decline. Yet few of these voices understand the hunger that drives the habit, the despair that makes forgetting more precious than food. For the poor themselves, hashish is not indulgence, but necessity, the cheapest way to endure lives that otherwise feel unbearable. Even the children of these households grow up inside the spiral. They see their fathers return home dazed, their mothers in tears. They hear the arguments, they feel the emptiness in their bellies, they watch the smoke cloud their homes. Some grow angry, vowing never to touch the pipe. Others grow curious, drawn to the same relief that captured their fathers. And so, generation after generation, the spiral continues, as much a part of the city as the Nile itself. There were moments when the spiral loosened, when a man found steady work, when a family managed to save a little, when hope returned briefly. But these moments were fragile, easily broken by sickness, by rising rents, by the endless demands of debt. A single misfortune could undo months of struggle, sending a family back into the arms of poverty, and back into the smoke-filled coffeehouses. Cairo in this century was a city caught between old and new. Foreign powers pressed their influence, factories rose, streets widened, and gas lamps replaced oil. Yet for the poor, little changed. Their lives remained bound to the same cycles of hunger and relief, toil and forgetting. Modernization brought no bread to their tables, no security to their homes. The spiral of hashish and poverty remained untouched, a constant beneath the surface of change. And through it all, the city breathed in its strange rhythm. Morning brought the cries of vendors and the clatter of donkeys. Noon brought heat so heavy it seemed to press the air flat. Evening brought the weary shuffle of men returning home, their pockets light, their stomachs empty. And night brought the coffeehouses alive, their rooms glowing faintly with lamps, their air thick with smoke. The spiral turned again, slow, patient, inevitable. The story of this spiral is not one of villains and heroes, but of ordinary people caught in forces larger than themselves. Poverty, hunger, shame, and relief intertwined, binding lives into a cycle difficult to escape. The rulers of Cairo came and went, the policies shifted, the city grew, but the spiral endured. For as long as poverty held the city's poor, Hashish would always be there, waiting, offering its fleeting comfort, drawing its victims deeper. So, as we leave this chapter, imagine once more the narrow alley at night. The stars hang above, the Nile moves silently in the distance, and from a dim coffeehouse comes the low murmur of voices, the faint laughter, the clink of cups, and the steady curl of smoke into the air. Outside, the world waits with all its hardships. Inside, for a little while, the poor forget. And the spiral, unseen but unbroken, continues to turn.